story. In fact, Gery and I, we've talked, we were introduced through another person, Melissa, and I love the way this works, the networking, and then we get connected, and then Gery and I offline extensively about some different topics. I'm actually really excited about this because of the fact the topic and the things that we're going to talk about, I've been running into, and I don't know if it's my age, I don't know. It's just, but I'm really, really grateful that you're here, Gery. I'm thankful that you're going to be able to talk some about this, and then we may go a little bit off track, but we'll see. So thank you for showing up. Thank you for being here.
Sure, no problem.
Yeah, so let's jump in. I love doing it because this is just the way we start every show is I just meet you in the elevator. And for our audience too, you got 30 seconds. Who is Gery?
Who is Gery? Can I do that?
You got to. You got an elevator at the
I've been called a lot of things, but I probably shouldn't say those on a podcast. No, I think for me, if I was going to describe myself, I don't like the word. Someone called me a Renaissance person once because my background and my interests are so diverse that I'm just kind of all over the place. But I grew up in a rural community, and I have a lot of different interests, from music to performance to writing to just all sorts of things. And I managed to take all those things and turn them into my job. And that's not something a lot of people are ever able to do. It doesn't, we're not driving around in limousines out here, but we've managed to keep it going, and that's part of who I am.
I love that.
Let's dive into other people can do better. I guess that's where
yeah. Well, and I know you're in TV and all the other, so you understand the timing, and so I'm sure you're probably watching the clock more so than most of the audience or most of the guests there. So, but that's cool. It's awesome. Brings a different perspective here. So let's go ahead and jump into some of the past. And I love this part of the show where we actually look at the belief system, the perspective that we have, which created our narrative growing up. And a lot of times we find that narrative is a false narrative because it was either modeled to us or somebody told us something in regards to how we're supposed to live our life. So what was your narrative growing up? What was the way that you thought you were going to live your life and be? What was that like for you?
Well, I guess I would say that I started out in the world a little rough. I came into the world with a whole series of birth defects. So my family was faced with a kind of an unusual situation. I was a late person. So that is to say my folks were in their 30s when I came along, and they already had two, mid-teen to late-teen kids. And I think what I learned from all that was, you were going to grow up and they were very protective of me. So you're going to grow up and go to school and get an education and go do things that didn't require the manual hard labor that my parents had done their whole lives. And they were worried that I couldn't handle that. So you sort of have this thing that you're taught, and then you get in school and you're getting it from teachers and you're getting it from counselors and all these other people saying, well, you have to go to college, you have to do these things, you have to do that. And then when I fast forward that a little bit and I think about, okay, so you do this, and I was headed for med school. That's a whole nother podcast, but I was on my way to med school, and I'm looking down the road, you're supposed to do that. Then you got to specialize, you've got residencies and fellowships and all that stuff. And then, looking at the future of that, I saw people on both sides of the world, essentially, if you want to think about it. My parents, they didn't plan very well for financial stuff because that's not how their families worked. They just worked until they dropped. That's kind of how it was. Nobody was in poverty or anything, but I guess my dad's family definitely was, but they still worked. They still kept it up. And my understanding was that you work, you get all these jobs, you work for 30 years for the same place. Because I was at the end of that era where you worked somewhere for 30 years and you got the gold watch. And you had
before we get into that, hang on, before it changed. Before we get into it, there's actually anymore, a bunch of really, I feel, in-depth things that you mentioned. And I'd like to explore those just a little bit deeper. Really, so, for example, you said the very first thing was you were placed and taught a path of what we would call success, or the narrative of how your life was going to live out. One, it was not going to be in regards to any kind of physical labor. You were probably going to medical field, but a deeper root of that was the fact that you were going to have to go through this educational process, get a job, stick with a job, retire, so on and so on. And then you also mentioned about so let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
Was that something that was an example set for you and you just adopted that? Or, well, and maybe kind of a situation. Was this something that people just kept telling you, this is what you're supposed to do, or this is how you're supposed to live? Okay.
I think it was and or. I think it was both, because I feel like what happened was my parents, I was taught by example. If we're going that way, let's look at that first. So the example that was set for me was mostly my dad. And I know you based on having conversations with Melissa, the grandmother that she was talking about in her story was my mom. She was she had this, like, we're not going to lose. We're going to keep doing this until we can't anymore. Whatever it was, she was just that fiery. But what I saw was my dad was a little bit more careful, because he came from a world where it was in the Appalachians and the southern Appalachians of Ohio. So you're in the foothills, so they didn't, a lot of his family didn't really, they worked all in the ore plants down there, the iron ore plants. They were moonshiners, and some of them were, local constables, and there were big family fights and all that. So his thing was stability. His mother died when he was 3. He was left with his aunt. His dad disappeared. So his thing was very different. It was like, I'm going to control my world from here on. So when he and my mother married, they were 18 years old, and, my brother was on the way after that, and all, just kind of, this is the early 1950s, right? So my dad made it so that he was never unemployed. He worked at the factories when he came to Dayton, Ohio, that's what you did. You worked at General Motors, and you know what it's like in Michigan, kind of the same way. And you did that. And all of my mother's brothers worked there too. So there was like this whole thing. That's what you did. But he knew, I don't know how he knew this, but he knew that was not going to last. So the thing that I was taught by example was, you take whatever skills you have and you use those to benefit yourself and your family and the people around you as best you can. And he never said that outright, but it was very apparent, because while he was working in the factory, he also started a concrete business. And while he was doing that, he started a trucking business for agricultural products. And then the factory went away. He ends up getting a job teaching vocational agricultural mechanics at a career center. And he did that for 16 years, all while the other stuff is still running. And we had a farm, a cattle farm. So I'm being exposed to, don't ever think you're going to be out of work, because you're going to be able to use all this stuff, while at the same time, I'm getting the lecture over on the other side. Got to do good in school. We got to get you through college, blah, 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 because they were worried about my physical health not being good enough. Now, the thing is, that was never an issue. I was out there throwing bales of hay and wrangling cows and doing everything everybody else did. So they didn't helicopter me. So I don't want to give that impression. But I think it changed from that to the other side of that, which is the or part, which is I'm getting from school. I'm getting from also a kind of contradictory message from my family, which was, and to be fair, I was a pain when I was a teenager. I didn't get in trouble or anything, but I did not want to run the trucks. I didn't want to be a farmer. I didn't want any part of that stuff. So it kind of worked out. I was headed that way anyhow. And I always thought I was smarter than everybody else. You know how that works. You're a kid and you're stupid and you think everybody else is dumb, and the best piece of advice I ever got was from an uncle of mine who pulled me aside one day and he goes,
so let's do this. Let's sum up, because you hit on a lot of really cool things. And there's, in everyeverybody's life, we all know this. There is
earlier, fortunately,
some things that we're taught and exemplified that are very positive.
I figured it out. They were pretty
There's also
smart
sometimes when our parents who are intending
you're getting
to
the
give us a
contradictory
positive
messages. So I think what
narrative,
ended up with me was
they
just
sometimes
trying to figure out
and
which
it's
thing I was
just
going to
more
do.
of out of
And
their good intention. They sometimes give us this wrong impression
while
that
I was in college.
we have to be more responsible than we are. And sometimes it's just the interpretation of the kids. So when we look at this, if you were to sum come up, what would be your narrative stepping into that college age, when right before you made that decision of, I'm not going to do medical, I'm not going to go that way? It sounds like you were very dogmatic about that, but what would you summarize as a narrative of your life, and whether that's the false part of it or even the true part that you keep even to this day? Mm.
Right.
Mm.
The true part that I keep to this day is that I have to do what internally I know I need to do.
So that's an interesting concept. I'm interrupting you, but that's an interesting concept, because you mentioned about the fact you take it on you.
I have this,
and yet there's this whole aspect, and I know you just mentioned this,
on you
growing up,
because everyone else will disappoint you.
The family very, very tight with your dad. Everybody supported each other, and sometimes there were some family feuds, but everybody supported each other. Everybody worked together. There's a strong sense of community that's going on there. So it's interesting that you pull out of that idea or the example
what they really are.
That I have to be independent versus we can depend on each other as part of a family.
And I really know who he was.
Maybe I don't know. Maybe I'm going too deep there, but
things. No, go ahead.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
I think that's what made it. No, you're right, but you're absolutely right. I think that's what made it work, is that while you can depend on these people, you have to also make sure that you're managing your own world in a way that no matter what they do, you're still going to hang in there. You've got it covered. You want to be able to depend on them. You want support. You don't want it to be a three-legged stool where if one goes away, down you go. You can't function like that. And I think when you see people really struggling with their lives, they have put all of their dependency on other people, to the point, or a religion or a job or something. They put all of their whatever it is into
and that's
that,
I think
and then there's nothing left of them.
No, but the value that you're taking away there, and some of that analytical type look at the past actually helps us. So what was the major shift, though? Because you were saying about some of these things, like competing ideas, values, narratives, all of these things kind of found, whether it was going to school or whatever, and then you made a hard, fast. So what was that shift like? And we can kind of start to the care about taking care of your parents and things like that. So
kind of a shield between me and
where was the perspective shift? What was the biggest thing that really kind of
people get through that,
shook your worldview or your perspective of how life was going to go
as you grow up? But it wasn't from my family. I couldn't ask for a better upbringing than what I had. I mean, we didn't have anything. We weren't wealthy or anything like that. Yeah. I think there were a couple of things. I think the main thing happened when I graduated with my first degree, because that is after I had changed schools. I had changed majors. I had gone into engineering and got out of, you couldn't get further away from medicine than what I ended up. But the fact that during that period of time, I learned that I could write. And I didn't know that. I was using that to pay for school. I was writing for a college paper and a couple local papers, and I was getting money for that because I needed a job. I lost my scholarships because I changed majors, so that the whole thing goes out the window. And I think understanding that that shifted, and
let me open up this little bit of a rabbit hole here.
A loss of a relationship
because you mentioned something.
There was a loss of school.
Well, I think this is really important.
Went away.
So many people I talk with, and so many times that we interview,
depending on all that stuff, and it just
their
goes
identity
away. That's what
is originally tied up with what they do.
Okay,
their identity is tied up with their family, and you're touching and talking about a concept here, not allowing that narrative, that narrative of who you are, that identity to be tied so tightly to education or to a job or to. Can we just dive into that just for a second? Because I think that's a really powerful concept that individuals need to hear and understand why it's so important not to tie your identity so strongly with your employee or with your education or with that.
It was a whole lot of stuff happened in that same time.
I love it.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to point you to an episode of Frasier. The first episode of the 6th season is called Good Grief. And it's all about Dr. Crane loses his job at the radio station the season before that. And in the season opener, he is now dealing with grief. And his brother Niles, if you've ever seen the show, he's got kind of a pompous brother to go with him. And he says things like, David Hyde Pierce does this beautifully. He says, people like Frasier, their job is who they are. And the loss of a job is like dealing with a death. And you go through the same stages. You go through denial, you go through anger, you go through acceptance, all those different things that happen during that. You go through that same thing. So if you take that little microcosm that they put together in that show, the idea for me was, if I'm dependent on any one thing and that one thing goes away, I am lost. I had a terrible, I think we do this and we don't realize we do it. I think I put a lot of my self-confidence was in what other people thought of me. And I think we have a terrible problem with the internet right now because of that, because that's social media in a nutshell. It's all the likes and the shares and all that. If you don't get enough likes, people hate me. And then we've got these kids committing suicide and stuff over stuff like this. But when it comes to the jobs and the school and all that stuff, from my aspect of it, it was just simply that if people out there are listening to this and they think they're only one thing, I strongly urge them to take another look at themselves. I'm not talking about therapy or something like that. I mean, just think about who you are. I'm no one thing, and that's crazy. I've written about this many, many times. It's one of the pieces I get. Whenever I write about this, I get feedback about it because people say, my mom always said I should be this and I got to be that. And then that's all I am. And then the job went away or the thing went away or whatever it was. And now I don't know who I am anymore. This relates to the caregiving thing we were talking about too, because so many people I know who had been caregivers and these are caregivers of older seniors, when that person dies, and they're going to, you have this gut emptiness. There's nothing there. You don't feel like you have a purpose anymore. And for some adult children of parents that they're looking after, that has become their identity. And I know, that's what I was getting that from the outside. Now I was very careful never to be that, because not for my own sake, but for my dad's sake. My mother, I had help. I had more help. It wasn't just me by any stretch. We had a whole crew looking after her. When I got to Dad, I really only had a couple of people, and it was much harder. But that concept of making sure that you're never just one thing, because we're not. I think society teaches us to be one thing. It teaches us we're supposed to be a firefighter or a lawyer or whatever it is that we are, and it becomes about our occupation. What's the first question anybody asks you when they meet you? So what do you do? I sit around and I eat Doritos. Mm-hmm. What would somebody say if you answered like that? It's just one of the things I'm sure you do sometimes, right? You got a bag of chips, and everybody does that. But that's not who we are anymore. Imagine if you were an alcoholic and somebody said, so what do you do? Well, I mostly sit around and drink. I mean, come on. That's not who you are. That's a problem you have to deal with. It's not a thing. But that's what I never liked. And it's kind of funny because I've had to over the last 10 years or so. I get that question.
Yeah.
And when when you own a business, people think you're scattered if you do multiple things. They think you have to be the one thing. So for the purposes of the outside world, writer, creator.
Think about this part of things because it's such an ingrained false narrative in our society.
One's a job and
your identity is tied up in what you do.
Creative director.
That I think we can make an entire episode out of this. So I'm so glad that we did go down this rabbit hole a little bit. But let's kind of redirect and come back. And you mentioned earlier about the fact of taking care of your parents and taking care of some of the challenges and the idea that gets tied up with caregivers, especially as they're caring for their parents or adults that are in their later years. Let's kind of focus on that. I know that was a challenge in some things, and I know you've done quite a bit of writing about this.
Tying
this together, one with the identity and the false narrative that you are only one thing.
Kindergarten was invented to break our spirits.
The fact that we are responsible at times, and we take on responsibility to care for those that are starting to be on that later part of life and starting to pass away and whatever.
I'm all for
so let's touch on this and see where the conversation goes to be able to help direct people into a way of saying, okay, let's just not this false narrative.
All right, what are you going to do?
That I am only this.
What are you going to be?
A caregiver.
Why does it have to be one thing? Yeah, you got to pay the bills. I get it. That's fine. But can't one of those things pay the bills? Why can't four of them pay the bills? That's how mine works. So there's your answer. I don't know if that helps or not.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would say essentially that when people get into that position, you are so immersed in the caregiving process that it's easy to understand how that becomes who you are, because it really is. I mean, especially in certain situations, if you're a 24/7 caregiver, you're not somebody that just stops in once in a while to look at mom and make sure she's okay, which is how it started with my dad. And then it became full time. So it's with my mother, she needed care from day one. So it was a whole different mentality. And it's different when you have a team versus when there's one or maybe two people doing most of the work. So it's a different mentality there. And I feel like to tie those two things together, you can get hooked into that just as easily as if you have, to say that's not a job is ridiculous. That's like telling a stay-at-home mom she doesn't work. That's ridiculous. So it's probably, to me and to the people I've talked to and people I've spoken with and done presentations for, the caregiving process is one of the most.
So how do you prevent
things you have to go through?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to. That's exactly where we're going with this. Is how do you prevent that? Again, I
or a
think
child
many
that
times
has a
people
disease
step
that is
into
very
the
likely going to be
caregiving
terminal.
situation
Those two things
because
are
it's
gut-wrenching.
they have to. I mean, there's just no other option. You have to step into that, and then they get blindsided
can't even
by
describe it
the
sometimes. It's just like
idea or this concept of it just
knowing
takes
there's
on
no hope.
everything and takes everything from you.
This
And they
person
get
is not going to
blindsided by
survive
that. Don't
this.
even realize
We
that
don't
that's
have
going to
as
happen. So
caregivers,
how do
we
you
don't
prevent
have
that from
a
happening?
ribbon or survivors to parade around. We are the survivors. We're the ones who have to go through this and then say, oh, well, you know, that yeah, I did that. Now what? You know, so you tie that together. But I think if you're thinking about how to, not only avoiding that feeling, that's really hard because you lose yourself in the whole thing. And it's not the same as having a job because, first of all, nobody's making you do it. We do that because we're supposed to. It's how we are. It's if most of the caregivers I know, now there's some out there that are just trying to get money or whatever they're trying to do. There's bad ones too, but for the most part, 99% of the people out there are doing it because they care about the person, because it's their family, it's their, you know, close relative, close friend, whatever it is. That's being done out of the goodness of their heart. And the problem is that they lose everything they are to it sometimes. And they don't realize that's going to happen. And then it just kind of goes sideways from there. So you have to pull away from that. Right. You can't. What you can do though is you can't prevent it from happening, but what you can do is minimize its damage. So you have to mitigate it a little bit. One of those things that I tell people to do is, first of all, don't forget about you. And here's the analogy I give them. If you're on an airplane, the first thing they do is give you the little safety instructions, right? And they show you the seat belts and all that stuff. But they tell you that if you have someone with you and the oxygen masks drop out of the ceiling, put it on you first and then help the other person. And that's a logic thing because if you pass out, you can't help the other person. So in this case, I tell people look after yourself, do whatever you can to keep yourself healthy and not sick and your mind clear and whatever you can do with that. And this is, I'm making a very small, you know, thing of this, but it's really hard. But do what you can there so that you can still take care of that person. By doing that, you'll help put a little bit of a barrier between that loss of self because you're still doing the things that you like to do. It's harder when we do things that are outside the house more often. Like if you're somebody who goes to the gym all the time and all of a sudden now you're a caregiver, you can't go to the gym anymore. But there are ways to get around that, right? We have stationary bikes, we have video, I mean, thank heavens for the internet. I mean, I don't know how we would have done that before. It would have been awful. But you have the ability to do these things. The hard part is allowing yourself to, because you feel guilty. There's a whole guilt thing associated with that. Well, if I'm doing this over here, and I used to have this all the time. If I'm going to go swim, I needed to swim. That's what I was doing. But it meant I had to leave my dad with somebody, or I had to make sure he was okay. For many, many years of this, he was by himself during the day, except for a few hours. So he was still doing okay. But it still ate at you. Like, what if he falls while I'm gone? Or what if this is going on? Or I should have been doing that. Or, you know, there's all this woulda, shoulda, coulda stuff going on. And then when something does go wrong, you blame yourself. And it's not your fault. Now, if you left tacks and broken glass in the kitchen for them to walk on, then yeah, that's your fault. But other than that, this is not your fault. You're doing the best you can. So you're putting a little barrier by keeping those things going. The other thing you can do is making sure, and this is very, very hard, if you have connections with friends, family, whatever, try not to lose them, because that outside influence is very, very important. And a lot of times, you know, I hear stories all the time, and I wrote about this as well, about how when you are a caregiver, you can't go out anymore. You can't go do the thing. I just spontaneously go to a movie or whatever. And you have to keep in mind, some of my perspective here is that I was doing this. The hardest part of this for me happened during COVID. So we were locked down. We couldn't go anywhere. We couldn't do anything. Fortunately, I have a nice area we could go
Yeah,
outside, and we could do stuff like that.
it makes perfect
But
sense,
there
and I
was
can
no
even take it
way
one
to
step
have that
further. And again, it's just through
interaction with
conversation of
people.
people that I've talked with.
And we're
They
social
feel
creatures.
guilty almost.
Someone would
when
argue
person
that I'm
does
not,
that
and I'm
or
really
does
not.
pass.
People are
And
terrible.
that guilt just
they're the worst.
eats away at
But,
them because they're like, well, I'm
I think
relieved that I
in
don't
the
have the
grand scheme of
demand
it,
and the
we
time
all
and
need
the
that
emotional
interaction
and
from
physical
somewhere.
drain. They're relieved.
And for me, it's being able to do things like this. It's being able to go and do my cycling because I spend a lot of time on the bike. I want to be able to do that. Whatever that stuff is that keeps you social, that keeps you active, that keeps you talking to people, so that you can't see this on a podcast, but the tunnel vision thing where you just blinders on either side of your head, that'll kill it. I mean, that'll make the thing so that you can't recover from this. And I would also recommend people, if they're so inclined, to get some counseling during the process, because you're going through something that is like grief, that's called anticipatory grief. You have it as the person is dying and you know they're dying, and you can't get out of that. And I'm talking about severe things like cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, things that deteriorate the person away from you over little bits at a time. And it may take years, but you're grieving them all along the way. Every time they have a downturn, every time you're in the hospital, every time, whatever, you go through it again. And it's almost like having when they finally die, that sometimes is either super overwhelming or it's easier to manage. But if you can recognize that you're doing that along the way, you can mitigate that as well. That will keep you from losing yourself as well. Does that make sense? Yeah. There's a lot to that. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
You feel guilty because you're relieved. Yes, you feel guilty because you're relieved. And the thing is, you will be relieved. It's a natural response. And the thing is, you have to keep in mind, you're also relieved for them.
Yeah.
Because the suffering is over.
No, I know.
The pain is over. All
so much more here, and let's do this because I know you've written several things.
There's something there
in the notes, and
I
think we can go down this road. But in the notes, here's what I'd like to do: is just attach some of the articles that you wrote on how the recovery and the process. And so, if you're good with that, I'd love to be able to include that in the notes.
Even after my dad died, I went through the counseling that hospice
Perfect. So we'll put all that stuff in the notes.
But everyone around me was going,
yeah, exactly. And so let's do that because I think that there's, especially those that are listening, if you're going through this at this exact moment, I would highly recommend and highly encourage you to go back and just start to read a little bit deeper into what Gerry has written and the experiences that he has, because we can only basically scratch the surface.
When you're the closest,
we can only start to talk about some of these shifts.
And you were standing there when they took their last breath. That changes you. That makes you appreciate having been there. Honestly, it's not as sad as you might think sometimes, but at the same time, that guilt that you're talking about, like even afterward, my thing was second guessing everything I had done to look after my dad. Every single thing. I second guess it all to this day. I will still think about, maybe I should have, and my brain will kick in and the logic goes, well, you did everything you could do. What else are you supposed to do here? And everybody tells you that, you get the platitudes and stuff. And then when, they're just like, oh, you're such a good son. I never know how to answer that, because it feels like, no, I'm really not. I just did what I was supposed to do. Not because I had to, but because they would have. They did. I mean, like I said, I grew up 15 years in and out of the hospital until I was 15 or 16 years old. It was a major surgery or a major procedure a couple of times a year. And there was my mom on the other side of the bed rail every moment of it. And so I wouldn't even give it a second thought, but that doesn't help how it feels afterward.
Yeah. Yeah, but some people age we're more readers, so that's why I was thinking the articles. But the podcast is great too, and I think
I can find the links.
Yeah, and I think this is going to be a really good in those that are dealing with some of these things. So we went a little bit longer. Appreciate those sticking with us and listening. But let's do this. What is that one thing that you would like to leave behind with the individual or people that are listening? What's the one thing that's most important?
We can, and you know, it is why I started, and I don't know where if you were headed to this or not. It's why I started the Old Nerd in the Gym podcast, was because the whole concept is about caregiving. It's about health and fitness, health and wellness for the caregiver. And the way I say it is that people, you know, the patient is being looked after. They've got all the care in the world. They have home care, they have doctors, they have whatever. You're doing it, you know, they're getting what they need. But the caregiver doesn't get any of that. So I took that and turned it into a podcast that was supposed to be to keep me motivated to get my workouts done, but that didn't go that way. And then the name stuck. So it's why it doesn't mean anything, but if you go listen, you kind of understand, because it's about age, because we're starting to see younger and younger people becoming caregivers. But like you said, I think people our age are experiencing that a lot more because people are living longer. So our parents are into their 80s, sometimes 90s, and we're in our 60s looking after them or whatever. That's
awesome. So,
and that becomes a whole thing.
How's the best way to get in contact? I'm sure there's going to be somebody who reaches out to you. So to get in contact with you, I know we're going to have the notes. We're going to have. But if somebody wanted to reach you directly, what's the best way to get in touch?
We do one with doctors talking about hospice and what you feel, or sorry, a hospice coordinator talking about what you feel like afterward. All this is covered in there, and it's really easy because you can get it on your phone. You don't have to read it, but they're both available.
Okay. Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. We'll definitely get all that stuff in the notes. Again, thanks for being here. Thanks for talking. Thanks for being authentic. I know at times people don't like to talk about these kinds of things and the grief and the challenges that they're going through. It's greatly valued, I think, in today's society, and we need more of this. So thank you so much for just being a part of that.
Don't let anybody put you in a box. If I was going to say anything to anybody, it's be whoever you are.
Absolutely. So, again, those that are listening, I say this, but I mean this, and I know,
make sure there's a you.
We are motivated.
Your shape is in that hole.
And when you tell us this really resonated with me, this really helped me. The kinds of things that we love to be able to hear. So I encourage people to give us the feedback, to write to,
with the gas pedal
whether you do it on Instagram or Facebook or wherever on social, just let us know what you're thinking and what's going on in your brain and how we've impacted you.
This is day-to-day.
So until the next story, next journey, next narrative about, make sure you continue to write yours, because every story matters, yours included.
I don't sing the sunshine, roses, and unicorns thing that you see on the internet with all the platitudes and the self-help nonsense. What I say is, life is hard, suck it up, do the things you're supposed to do, and make sure that somewhere in there you leave enough for yourself. Especially if you're doing things like being a caregiver, you got a house full of kids, you got jobs that take up all your time. You have to do that to maintain who you are. So don't let people put you in a box that says you're only this, because you're not. Nobody is. Probably the easiest way, there's two ways you can find me on Facebook and Instagram, and it's under official Gerry Deer, or you can look up GLD Communications, and there's a contact page there. Is easy enough to get a hold of me, and all our links are there too if you're trying to find something specific. Sure. I appreciate it. The thing I tell people is, even with my newspaper column, if one person hears it or reads it and it affects them in some good way, I've done my job. So thanks for letting me tell that story.